I call the honourable member Grant Robertson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I rise to oppose this bill, and I think the speech we've just heard from Simon Bridges gives us some insight into what the problem is here. He spoke for, 3 or 4 minutes about legislation that he himself tells us is significant and important and covering a significant and important agency, and he can't even be bothered filling up his time to talk about that. This is, as David Shearer has said, a band-aid solution. There are significant issues at play here for our security, for our human rights, for privacy, and this government thinks that it can sweep under the carpet all of the problems, the debacle that's taken place over Kim.com and the GCSB's behaviour, sweep all of that under the carpet with this piece of legislation. Well, Mr Speaker, that is simply not good enough. And we do need a full inquiry. We need that inquiry, Mr Speaker, because this is not just about the GCSB. This is about all of the intelligence agencies that work in New Zealand. And we know that the SIS legislation had been drafted. We know that there were to be changes to the way that the SIS operates. Since the 2003 Act was passed, Ofcans has come into existence, the police's organised crime agency. We know that Defence Intelligence now apparently wants the GCSB working with them as well. There is an interconnected group of intelligence agencies, and for the Prime Minister to come down to this House and put in place a piece of legislation that sticks a band-aid over a problem that he doesn't want New Zealanders to focus on in the GCSB and say that that's the answer to everything is simply wrong and unacceptable. And Mr Speaker, it is not just the Labour Party that's saying this. I want to quote from John Armstrong's column in the New Zealand Herald from Thursday the 11th of April. This is what he said. A full inquiry is needed because formally allowing the GCSB some room to function in a domestic context is potentially a huge foot in the door in that arena, whatever conditions or provisos are put on such a change. Mr Speaker, he calls it number 8 fencing wire stuff, and that is not good enough when we are talking about an agency with the intrusive powers of the GCSB. And Mr Speaker, doing this, enlarging the functions in this way, and it's simply not credible for Judith Collins and Simon Bridges to tell us that there is no enlarging of the function here. There quite clearly is. Now, whether or not that is justified, given the changes in terms of cybersecurity, given the different agencies that now operate in New Zealand, we simply don't know today, and that's why we need that formal inquiry. But it's quite clear when we look into the detail of the language in this bill, Mr Speaker, that the assistance that the GCSB is now going to be able to provide agencies is in, quote, their lawful functions. It's not got anything necessarily to do with national security. It just says in their lawful functions. What does that mean, Mr Speaker? What greater powers does that give? Are we moving here away from information assurance into some other kind of area? What priorities are going to be put on the GCSB? We can't answer any of these questions, Mr Speaker, because we simply don't have enough information about the way that these agencies interact with each other. But the scale of the change here, Mr Speaker, justifies far more than a band-aid solution. This goes beyond clarifying the law. It goes into how this agency operates. And Mr Speaker, it's very important that people understand what the distinction is between the GCSB and, let's take one of the other agencies, the SIS. And that distinction is that the GCSB operates as part of an international network. And the assurance I think many New Zealanders would want to know is if the GCSB is going to be given powers to work with other agencies, what assurance do New Zealanders have that that information is not being passed overseas? Because the very nature of the expertise that the GCSB is bringing to the table is their connection with international agencies. And so here we have a fundamental change to what the premise of the difference between, in this case, the GCSB and the SIS. That's not a minor clarification. That is a fundamental change in the way the agency works. And just putting a bill before Parliament and saying this is just to clarify what we're already doing isn't good enough when it comes to addressing the differences and the distinctions between those two agencies. As David Shearer has said, there may well at the end of an inquiry be a need to change this legislation, to take account of new technology, to take account of new threats. But it is not good enough to bring this in and not have the discussion about that as part of a wider and full inquiry. Mr Speaker, when I obtained the documents from the court about the Kim.com case, one of the things that struck me about the documents that came from the GCSB as part of those court documents were the classifications on the top of each page of those documents. And having worked in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, I'm used to the various titles and names, but there were some that I didn't recognise. And on further investigation, what they were classifications that indicated that this material was going to be shared with international agencies. Now, we've been told by various people within the GCSB publicly that this material wouldn't be shared. But that information, those designations on those documents, indicate that it is routine for GCSB information to be shared internationally. What assurances do New Zealanders have that under this legislation, if the GCSB is working with those other agencies, that information will not be shared overseas? Mr Speaker, it seems to me that the fundamental purpose for the government in bringing this legislation to this House is to sweep under the carpet John Key's role in the Kim.com affair. Because for all of Rebecca Kitterich's report into what was going wrong at the GCSB, the one thing she wasn't allowed to investigate was the Kim.com case. The one thing that actually started all of this off, the Kim.com case, she could not investigate. And that's because the Prime Minister does not want New Zealanders to know about his role in that affair. We have managed over months and months to drag information out from the Prime Minister, and we now know that as early as July last year, he was aware of unlawful spying and he did nothing, Mr Speaker. He did nothing about that. In May, the Inspector General raised concerns about this, and the GCSB, we are asked to believe, did nothing about that then until they talked to the Prime Minister in July. What we do know, Mr Speaker, is that in February 2012, the GCSB knew that their spying on Kim.com had been unlawful. Where was the Prime Minister in all of that? There's a lot of talk in this legislation about oversight and the importance of oversight. We have seen the most lax oversight of this agency by John Key, the Minister responsible for GCSB. And that's why he doesn't want us to look into that. Well, Mr Speaker, we cannot have a proper conversation about changes to the GCSB Act without knowing exactly what went on in the Kim.com case. And David Shearer has already mentioned the fact that Australia has had such an inquiry, and one of the outcomes of that inquiry, Mr Speaker, was greater parliamentary oversight. And I strongly believe that we do need that. There are some things in this bill that are useful around the oversight. The expansion of the Inspector General's office to have a Deputy Inspector General, that is a good thing. We need to look at the clauses around how that person's appointed, but I think widening the pool beyond the retired judge is a good thing as well. But what about that parliamentary oversight? In our democracy, we need to have confidence in institutions and agencies such as the GCSB. Public confidence in our intelligence agencies is rock bottom, Mr Speaker, and putting up band-aid legislation is simply not going to satisfy that. And I'm going to appeal now, Mr Speaker, to parties in this House who could stop this legislation and give us the full inquiry that we need. And I want to quote something that Peter Dunn said in October last year, because I believe that he is actually right in what he said. He said, when talking about the intelligence agencies, "I believe very strongly that when exercising their responsibilities, the agencies of the state must at all times act within the law they are pledged to uphold. In a free state, it cannot logically be otherwise." And he finishes by saying, "Free societies operate on the basis of mutual consent. We respect the authority of the state because we believe it to be exercised in our best interests. When confidence in our institutions is diminished by their own actions, the cohesion of our society is eroded. That erosion and where it might lead me has me feeling uncomfortable right now." That's what Peter Dunn said last year. This legislation cannot get rid of the discomfort that he feels, because all it is doing is putting a band-aid over the problems that he himself identified. I am calling on Mr Dunn and others to oppose this legislation, because New Zealanders deserve a full inquiry into our intelligence agencies to restore confidence in them and to create around them the legal and oversight framework that can balance together issues of national security, freedoms and privacy. That is the only responsible course to take, Mr. Speaker. This bill does not take that course.
Very good.
I call the honourable member Dr. Russell Norman. Tēnā koe.